Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Middle East interventions before 9/11. The core question is this: how did oil containment, arms, and crisis diplomacy pull the United States into Middle East interventions before 9/11? The core competency is to characterize America's various foreign policy interventions across the Middle East before and after 9/11-2001.
How long can a superpower bomb, sanction, arm, patrol, and threaten a region before it has to admit that it understands the shipping lanes better than the societies living beside them? That is the right opening question for U.S. intervention in the Middle East before 9/11. American policymakers entered the region with carrier groups, intelligence channels, oil calculations, alliance commitments, and Cold War habits. They rarely entered with much patience for the local political consequences those tools created. This story does not start with terrorism in 2001. It starts with a strategic map built around petroleum, anti-Soviet containment, and support for regimes considered useful. That map shaped how American officials read Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and the Persian Gulf. It rewarded short-term stability, maritime access, and military leverage. It did not reward humility about nationalism, religion, post-colonial memory, or resentment created by foreign backing for unpopular rulers. Pre-9/11 intervention was an effort to project power without accepting the burdens of deep political reconstruction. Washington wanted oil routes protected, hostile regimes contained, allies reassured, and public humiliation avoided. The preferred tools were covert action: arms transfers, naval patrol, sanctions, expeditionary air power, and coalition warfare with limited formal aims. That approach looked efficient from the Pentagon briefing table. It looked different from Tehran, Beirut, Baghdad, or the refugee camps. The civic problem sits inside the method. If a republic keeps intervening to secure interests while refusing to own the social wreckage left behind, does restraint become wisdom or just a habit of externalizing costs? That question shapes the later wars after 9/11 because those wars grew out of habits already in place. The strategic order before 9/11 was built over decades. After World War II, American leaders treated Middle Eastern oil as essential to the industrial economies of the United States and its allies. The region's location also carried strategic value. Access to the Suez Route, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the Persian Gulf fit Cold War planning. Officials feared Soviet influence, nationalist governments that might nationalize resources, and any instability that could disrupt shipping or allied energy supply. The 1953 coup in Iran showed how these priorities worked. Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, challenging British control, and alarming American officials who also feared communist openings. The CIA and British intelligence helped remove him in Operation Ajax and strengthen Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. From Washington's perspective, the operation protected oil and blocked instability. From many Iranians' perspective, it showed that the United States preferred a compliant monarch to genuine sovereignty. That resentment did not disappear when policy memos stopped mentioning it. Arab-Israeli conflict deepened the stakes. U.S. support for Israel grew through military, diplomatic, and domestic political channels, especially after the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. Arab nationalism, Palestinian displacement, and repeated warfare made the region impossible to reduce to oil alone. Yet oil remained the point where regional politics could directly punish the West. The 1973 Arab oil embargo sent prices upward and exposed vulnerability in the United States. Gas lines and inflation taught American voters that Middle Eastern politics could enter domestic life quickly. The Carter Doctrine in January 1980 formalized the new threshold. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Iranian Revolution, President Jimmy Carter declared that any outside attempt to gain control of the Persian Gulf region would be regarded as an assault on vital U.S. interests and repelled by force if necessary. That doctrine linked energy, security, and military commitment openly. The Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force and later U.S. Central Command grew from the desire to project force into the region faster and more reliably. American officials also deepened the Saudi relationship as the security order hardened. Franklin Roosevelt's 1945 meeting with King Ibn Saud aboard the USS Quincy symbolized the exchange that followed: energy access and strategic partnership in return for security cooperation.
By the 1980s, that relationship included AWACS surveillance debates, arms sales, training missions, and repeated efforts to reassure Gulf monarchies that U.S. naval and air power would remain available. The bargain gave Washington staging access, intelligence ties, and oil market influence, but it also tied American credibility to monarchies many regional critics viewed as repressive or externally protected. Alternatives existed. Washington might have accepted more distance from authoritarian partners, pursued energy transition with greater seriousness, or treated Palestinian statelessness as a central strategic issue rather than a recurring complication. Those alternatives would have been difficult and politically costly. The easier pattern was selective intervention plus denial. That selective intervention carried its own accumulating price. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the hostage crisis pushed these tensions into public crisis. The Shah, long supported by the United States, fell amid mass protest, clerical leadership, and fury toward repression and foreign influence. In November 1979, Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held American diplomats hostage for 444 days. Carter faced domestic humiliation, legal limits, intelligence uncertainty, and a revolutionary regime that saw compromise as weakness. Operation Eagle Claw, the April 1980 rescue attempt, ended in desert failure after helicopter and transport problems collided at Desert 1, killing 8 U.S. servicemen. The images of wreckage and impotence were politically devastating. In the 1980s, the United States navigated the Iran-Iraq War with strategic opportunism and moral compromise. Iraq under Saddam Hussein fought revolutionary Iran from 1980 to 1988 in a war of trenches, missiles, and chemical weapons. Washington tilted toward Iraq because Iranian revolutionary power looked more dangerous to regional order, even though Saddam's regime was brutal and used chemical agents. At the same time, the Reagan administration became entangled in the Iran-Contra affair, secretly facilitating arms sales to Iran and diverting proceeds toward the Nicaraguan Contras. The scandal exposes how anti-communist improvisation and regional maneuvering could produce illegal policy channels. The late 1980s tanker war in the Gulf exposed how quickly energy security became military escort. Kuwaiti tankers were reflagged under the U.S. flag in Operation Earnest Will. American naval presence increased to protect shipping from Iranian attack. In 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655, killing 290 civilians after mistaking it for a hostile aircraft. The tragedy revealed the danger of high-tech force operating under pressure in crowded waters, where fear and identification mistakes could carry catastrophic cost. The same period showed how quickly escort missions could turn into direct retaliation. After the guided missile frigate USS Stark was hit by Iraqi aircraft in May 1987, killing 37 sailors, the United States still judged Iran the larger strategic problem in Gulf shipping. In April 1988, Operation Praying Mantis struck Iranian naval targets after the frigate USS Samuel B. Roberts hit an Iranian mine. Oil platforms, patrol boats, and frigates became targets in a single day of combat. Limited intervention still required minesweepers, radar coordination, tanker routing, and commanders making identification decisions in waters crowded with civilian traffic. The Gulf crisis of 1990 to 1991 then displayed the most polished version of pre-9/11 intervention. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait on August 2, 1990, hoping to seize resources, erase debt pressure from the Iran-Iraq War, and dominate a neighboring state whose oil policy he resented. President George H.W. Bush built a large coalition that included NATO allies and Arab states, secured United Nations backing, and deployed U.S. forces into Saudi Arabia through Operation Desert Shield. The coalition's formal goal was clear: expel Iraqi forces from Kuwait and restore Kuwaiti sovereignty. Limited war offered the United States maximum legitimacy with minimum occupation burden. Coalition war could protect oil flow, demonstrate post-Cold War leadership, punish aggression, and stop short of marching to Baghdad. Bush, Secretary of State James Baker, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Colin Powell, and General Norman Schwarzkopf all understood that coalition unity depended on restricted aims. Arab partners who would support liberation of Kuwait were far less likely to support conquest of Iraq. Public memory of Vietnam also constrained policy. A war with a narrow mission and an exit plan looked politically sustainable. Operation Desert Storm began with a massive air campaign in January 1991, followed by a 100-hour ground assault in February. Precision-guided munitions, satellite imagery, televised briefings, and overwhelming force created an image of clean efficiency. Yet even this successful war carried harder facts. Retreating Iraqi conscripts and military columns were destroyed on the so-called Highway of Death. Iraqi infrastructure suffered major damage. Kurdish and Shiite uprisings after the ceasefire were encouraged rhetorically, but left vulnerable when the coalition chose not to overthrow Saddam. Iraqi state power survived and later turned violently against internal opponents. The 1990s became a decade of containment without settlement. The United States and Britain enforced no-fly zones over northern and southern Iraq. Sanctions remained in place under United Nations authority. Saddam stayed in power, Iraqi civilians suffered shortages and infrastructural decay, and U.S. aircraft continued periodic strikes. Meanwhile, American troops remained in Saudi Arabia, a fact that became one grievance cited by Osama bin Laden. The strategy had avoided occupation. It had not avoided permanent entanglement. That entanglement had administrative costs that rarely made the front page. Carrier groups required repeated deployments. Aerial patrols required fuel, maintenance, and rules of engagement. And sanctions enforcement demanded diplomacy with allies who did not always share Washington's patience. Intelligence estimates had to keep reassessing Iraqi weapons capacity, regime intent, and regional reactions, while policymakers publicly defended a strategy that neither removed Saddam nor normalized Iraq. Managed force looked tidy on television because the bookkeeping stayed mostly off camera. George H.W. Bush's January 16, 1991 address announcing military action in the Persian Gulf is a model of post-Vietnam executive language. Bush said, we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. That phrase was chosen carefully. It translated a regional war into a universal principle. In Bush's wording, the conflict became a test of whether aggression would stand in the world after the Cold War. The tactical value of the source lies in how it narrows the moral field. Bush stresses law, coalition, sovereignty, and necessity. He does not dwell on American dependence on Gulf oil, long U.S. support for friendly authoritarian regimes, or the possibility that victory might leave Saddam in place and the region unstable. The address compresses complexity into legitimacy. It tells citizens that force is being used not for conquest, but for order. Short phrases do the work. This aggression will not stand. A new world order. The sovereignty of Kuwait will be restored. Each phrase makes military action sound finite, legal, and broadly shared. Bush wanted domestic support, Arab coalition endurance, and a post-Cold War image of disciplined American leadership. The speech delivered all three at once, yet the source is also revealing because of what it excludes. If the war is about international law, why had law been so inconsistently applied elsewhere? If the war is about sovereignty, what about Palestinians living without one? If the war is about order, who will manage the sanctions, no-fly zones, and Iraqi survival that follow? The speech treats war termination as if it will resolve the political problem. History answered differently. In the Oval Office, on briefing paper, and then on national television, the address functioned as a weapon of controlled framing. It sold a limited war brilliantly. It could not eliminate the unresolved conditions that limited war left behind. Pre-9/11 intervention in the Middle East taught American leaders that force could be calibrated, televised, and legally framed with great sophistication. It also taught them the more dangerous lesson that unresolved political conditions could be postponed indefinitely if the Navy kept patrolling, sanctions kept biting, and air power kept signaling resolve. That is not settlement, it is managed instability. The consequences accumulated quietly. Iranians carried the memory of the 1953 coup, the Shah sanctions, and the Vincennes shootdown. Iraqis carried the memory of war, embargo, uprisings, and no-fly zones. Saudis and other regional populations carried the memory of American troops stationed near holy sites and of governments sustained by external protection. Palestinians carried the memory of a diplomatic order that never solved statelessness. Americans carried a different memory. That intervention could be sharp, limited, and successful if it avoided ground occupation. That belief would shape later decisions. So the period before 9/11 should not be taught as a calm prelude. It was a school in strategic habits. U.S. officials learned to rely on sanctions, coalition air war, carrier presence, covert channels, and alliance management. They did not learn how to convert those tools into legitimate political order across the region. The unresolved judgment problem is severe. If the United States had deeper interests in oil flow, allied security, and deterrence, it was never going to leave the region untouched. But if it kept intervening through methods designed to protect interests without accepting lasting political responsibility, then every limited action risked storing up the resentment and instability that made the next intervention easier to justify.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.